call now, please.
And I will mute my.
And everybody else too, please. You got one more to mute. And our user friend needs to be muted too, if you can find them.
Oh, that's unusual. It won't let me mute them.
Well, hopefully they're quiet. Okay, so far they have been. All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to start. So thank you, first of all, welcome to everybody that's on the call. And thank you especially to Dennis Tusnard from Watrous Holden, who's joining us today as our guest and has graciously offered his time and his expertise in employment law to provide guidance on establishing a workplace vaccination policy. Employers have a duty to keep their workplace safe, so we're hoping this session will help businesses establish a policy that ensures both workers and their customers are protected. Melissa did send out a policy template earlier to everyone that was attending today. That was provided by David Prang from the Brantford Brant Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, David, for that. And if you want to use it as a jumping off point, you certainly are welcome to when creating your own policy. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we bring this session to you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the neutral peoples. I think it's important to recognize that they have been stewards of the land since time began here. So thank you for that. And we will begin with questions that the registrants provided prior to the session. We got a number of questions that came in. If you have any questions during the webinar, please indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, and Melissa will get to you. We'll call on you if we're able to in the time allotment. This is only going to be an hour session, and we want to be mindful of people's time. If we don't get to your questions, we will follow up afterwards. Dennis has said he will respond back with any questions that we get. And thank you again. So first question. As a business, are we required by law to post our policy in our establishment or simply share that we have one?
So outside of those industries that have been mandated, you don't have to have a vaccination policy, but you do have to have a policy for COVID-19, and that could include a vaccination component. In either case, you don't have to post a policy, your COVID-19 policy. You just have to have one, and you have to have it available if a worker were to ask for it, or the Ministry of Labor came in and asked for it. So you have to have one. It doesn't necessarily have to have a vaccination component if you're outside of one of those industries, but of course the trend has been overwhelmingly towards having a vaccination policy. It's not one of the questions, but one of the things that I came across in sort of looking into this, KPMG had done a survey back in August. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but 62% of employers in Ontario either had or were planning on putting in a vaccination policy. And anecdotally, that's what I've seen. I mean, I'm doing a lot of them, and I'm getting a lot of questions from businesses locally about whether they, not even so much whether they should have one, but what it can look like.
Okay, thanks. Question 2. If a customer employee does not want to comply with our policy, are there legal ramifications for the business to not let them enter?
So there are two different criteria. So let's start with the employees first. So if you have a policy, it's going to depend on what the policy says. I haven't seen the chamber template policy, but speaking really broadly, what a vaccination policy, if you're going to have one, should look like is first disclosure of your vaccination status, with your policy identifying that how the information is going to be kept confidential, confirming that the policy is indefinite in nature and it could change as the requirements to have a vaccination policy change. Some commitment to destroying the confidential information that you're receiving from your employees, because these are treated as health records if they're your employee, how you're going to do that, restrictions on who's going to be able to see it. The next thing is it has to have some exception for grounds protected by the Human Rights Code. And there's a number of grounds protected by the Human Rights Code. As far as vaccinations are concerned, it's really, from my perspective, it's health and maybe religion. There's certainly an ability to make a claim for religion in practice, whether that gets triggered or not is it's a lot less likely. The tribunal's commission has come out with a statement saying vaccination policies in the workplace are generally permissible, but they have to allow for people with medical exceptions. They have to allow for religious and other protected exceptions. And it has to recognize the policy isn't going to be there necessarily forever, which I think we all hope for anyway. So then the next, where some of the policies then start to diverge is, well, what do you do with those persons who are not vaccinated and don't have a human rights protection? Some businesses are saying you're not allowed to work in the premises, period. Some people are permitting rapid testing as a substitute, and then you have to decide whether or not you're going to allow the employees to conduct the tests at home and submit the results to you, or whether you're going to require a third party like Shoppers Drug Mart to do it and submit the tests to you. If it's a third party, you got to think about who's going to be paying for it, you or your workers. But in either event, then your policy, if you're going to have a policy that requires vaccination, what your policy should say is you can't come into the workplace if you haven't met the terms of our policy. So either to be fully vaccinated or have a human rights protected exemption, or to have submitted to rapid antigen testing and you've qualified for that. At that point, your policy should say to your employees, if you're not in compliance with our policy, you're going to be subject to discipline. If you provide anything to us intentionally false, like you provide us a fake proof of vaccination or a fake rapid testing result, then that should be subject to discipline, including termination. I would want my policy to say, and the ones I write say, that would amount to willful misconduct within the meaning of the Employment Standards Act, and allow you to terminate without compensation. So the remedy for your employees is, if you have a policy that says you can't work in the building unless you're in compliance with the policy, then you can tell them they can't come into the building. There are some risks, because these cases have not yet been tested. This is all pretty new. There's some risks that an employee, depending on the circumstances, may be able to say, well, that amounts to a repudiation of my employment agreement. That's such a significant change in my job duties that I'm allowed to seek termination pay, severance pay from you. I don't know where those are going to go. What my sense right now is general support for reasonable policies that are indefinite in nature. But again, those cases haven't made their way in front of a judge yet. Customers is a different kettle of fish. If you're providing services to your customers, you also have obligations under the Human Rights Code. But again, the Human Rights Tribunal has said that vaccination policies are generally permissible. So you'd still have to have some way to deal with persons who had legitimate health or potentially religious exemptions, and find a way to offer them services that may not include coming into the building. But otherwise, you are entitled as a private business owner to simply say, no, you can't. You're not allowed in our building. We have a mandatory vaccination policy, and you can't come in. You don't owe your customers the same types of obligations that you do to your employees. So you're perfectly entitled to tell them they're not allowed in. It's a private place, and subject to compliance with your obligations not to discriminate in the provision of services. You're perfectly entitled to do so. So it would kind of depend on a case-by-case basis. I mean, so for example, like in our law office, we have put in a mandatory vaccination policy for our workers, not for our customers. But if we were to put one in for our clients, then there are other ways that we could still provide services to clients that don't require them actually being in our building. We can do calls, we can do meetings on Zoom like this. We can meet with them outside of the physical premises in those events that they have to sign documents and they're not able to set up a video conference in order to do it. So there'll be, depending on what your business is, there'll be other ways for persons who have human rights protected grounds in order to provide them the services as well. And of course, just from a business standpoint, ways that you want to still be able to service your customers without shooing them all away over and above your sort of minimum legal obligations.
Right. Good, thank you. I think that clarifies a lot of questions that are on here, but I'll make sure. This is question 3, does the health unit or other government body have to approve our policy?
No, no, they don't. Now, the health unit you may want to work with, because especially for those exceptions. So either your workers who have human rights protected grounds, right? Because what you're going to do with them is you're going to let them come into work, but you have to find some other way to make your office reasonably safe. And the answer, appears to be provide rapid antigen testing, proof of negative results. And so where the health unit becomes of assistance is to say, what's reasonable, what's regular testing, what affords our workers some safety. What I'm being told and what I've seen, at least locally and beyond, is the recommendation of 2 times a week separated by 72 hours. And like everything else in this pandemic, that may change. So you don't need their blessing, but you may want to work with those health units to ensure that your exceptions to your policy are still affording your employees, your workers, and those people who also visit your building the kind of safety you're obliged to provide statutorily, either under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to your workers or under the Occupiers Liability Act to your customers.
Okay, so I might just jump down. Question 8 kind of deals with what you're talking about. So should there be a provision in the policy for the interim testing of an employee before they are fully vaccinated? So they could submit to rapid testing, as you said, 2 times weekly. And if there's a positive result, they're subject to isolation and then have to provide a negative PCR test before returning. Like, should you be writing that right into the policy?
Yeah, you should, because just thinking of it practically, right? These are new, and you're going to have some workers who are not yet fully vaccinated. So then you have to decide, well, what are we going to do with those workers? Are we going to say, like, if you have a worker right now who has not had a COVID-19 vaccine at all, that you're essentially looking at an absolute minimum of 6 weeks before they're fully vaccinated, and that assumes they can get an appointment right away, that they can get their second appointment within the minimum duration, plus the 2 weeks after the second appointment before you qualify as fully vaccinated. So what are you going to want to do with those people? You're going to want to send them away? I mean, most of us, I think, have some, staffing requirements, and we're not overstaffed to the point that we can afford to just send people away for a month and a half, nor is it, maybe the best way to deal with somebody you want to keep. So what I think makes sense is you say, in addition to the human rights exemption, and this is assuming that you're not going to have a general exception for persons who regularly submit to rapid testing. If you're sort of in that wheelhouse, then what you can say to those people on a transition basis is, okay, you can continue to come into the workplace on the following conditions. You provide proof that you've scheduled your vaccinations, that you submit to rapid testing, whatever our policy says is regular, while you're getting vaccinated, that you provide proof following your appointments that you've actually received the vaccination, whether it's for your first and your second, or just your second, depending on where they're at. And then once you become fully vaccinated, you can transition them away from the rapid testing. If you're going to have a rapid testing exemption period, because you think that's fair, or because you're worried about what impact it may have on your workers, if you don't have a more flexible policy, then it's sort of immaterial, because they're just going to be doing rapid testing anyway. So that question to me is really about that transition period from when your policy takes effect. The other thing you can do, and some people have done, is they can delay when the policy comes into effect. So you sort of give your workers lead time to get themselves fully vaccinated before the policy comes into effect. And I might be guilty of overthinking this, but my thought on that is as follows. You're implementing the policy on the basis that it's a health and safety requirement, and you've made a decision as the business owner, because this problem's been downloaded onto you, to say that to provide health and safety, we need a fully vaccinated workforce, or we need a workforce that's fully vaccinated or has proof of rapid antigen testing. And I have a hard time reconciling how you can make the decision that you need to do that in order to make your workplace safe, but you can wait 2 months before it comes into effect. I don't think it's necessarily wrong, and like I said, I may be overthinking it, And if anybody's done that, I don't have any serious problems with it, because the flip side of that argument is, well, look, we've gone this long with masks and spacing and hygiene and all the other requirements that we've been put in and that we've updated as reasonably necessary since March of 2020. And so what's another 2 months? But that's the decision. You put in a policy, you got to decide, are we going to have it kick in right away? And if we kick it in right away, what are we going to do with those employees who are transitioning to becoming fully vaccinated if we're not going to allow them rapid testing? Or are we going to delay the implementation of the policy to afford those employees time to get fully vaccinated, and essentially say, you know, this is coming in December and you have to be fully vaccinated by, you know, whatever the day is, or some combination thereof.
Okay, that's good. Now, you made reference to exemptions. So should the policy state what medical exemptions are considered to be legitimate, or you mentioned religious exemptions are considered to be legitimate for non-vaccinated status? And should it also state what documentation is required to prove an exemption?
So it should say there's an exemption for any human rights protected ground. It should say on top of that, it should say medical exemptions. You should not be opining on what those medical exemptions are, but you should say what you require, which is a certificate from a physician or a nurse practitioner. And your policy should also identify that the certificate from the physician or the nurse practitioner should also identify whether or not the medical exemption is time limited, and if it's time limited, when that changes. Because if it's, if there's a period of time where it's not safe in the opinion of the treating physician to have a vaccine, but that may expire, then you have an obligation to then to follow up after that time period to either get a new medical certificate or to have your worker comply with your vaccination policy. And again, that's a lot more important on those policies that don't just allow the rapid testing exemption on an indefinite basis. That's really where you need to have it, the language in your policy to your question, Sue, but
yep.
But the follow-up obligation is really, that becomes more important for those workplaces that are going to not allow rapid testing as an indefinite exception, except for those people who have human rights grounds. I think you're just creating enough rope to hang yourself with if you try and give some guidance to your workers about what they need to do to prove an
exemption, right?
An exemption other than the request for a medical certificate. I think you'd have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. My expectation for a religious exemption is that, and certainly the position I would be taking as counsel would be that, if you would need to be able to demonstrate you're a member of a religion, and you would need something from essentially the head of that religion confirming that members of that particular religion are not allowed to get a COVID-19 vaccine. So, at the risk of sounding a little intolerant, but if I'm Catholic, then I need to prove I'm Catholic, and that the Pope or the Vatican says that Catholics don't get a vaccine. Like that's what we're talking about, or the equivalent thereof in some other religious group. It's not going, and the reason for that is that there are all kinds of arguments that could be made by workers to say, well, my religion believes, so one of the examples is abortion, right? So my religion is that I practice it believes against abortion, and there's some data that would say the mRNA vaccine was made in part with the use of fetal cells, and so some people have drawn a connection between that. You can't get stuck in the weeds. You say that's unless you have something from the head of your body. So unless you have something from the equivalent of the Vatican saying, because of that, we're telling the members of our religious group not to get vaccinated. In my view, you should be holding the line and saying that doesn't qualify. And I expect that that's the approach that will be taken by the tribunal if anybody were to bring those kinds of cases to the Human Rights Tribunal.
Okay.
Now
you
sorry.
Oh, sorry, Melissa.
Sorry to interrupt you. I had a question or kind of a comment in relation to that, Dennis. An employee at my husband's work recently joined a church, and he's not a religious person, and we know this because we know him outside of work. He joined the church to get the letter saying that he doesn't have to get the vaccine because now it's part of his religion and he doesn't have to get the vaccine. That is a sticky situation because we know why he joined the church, but my husband's employer is not willing to go to bat for that and fight it. But it's just, it's such a gray area. And it's not my place or anybody else's place to say whether or not you're 100% in with your religion. Like that's not our.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, look, if you got into it, I don't know that you'd want to, but if you got into it, one of the issues would be you'd have to demonstrate you're actually a member of that religion. I mean, probably in the example you gave, the issue is going to be just because you got a letter from somebody at that church does not necessarily mean that to be a member of that religion, you can't get a COVID-19 vaccine. And that's where I think most of the distinctions are going to be drawn. Just because, an individual priest or pastor or imam or other religious leader of a small group or who you actually see takes a position that they're against COVID-19 vaccines, unless the religion as a whole says our religion does not permit our members to get a COVID-19 vaccine, I think they're going to have a hell of a time convincing the tribunal that they qualify. So that's where I would draw the line. If you ended up in a human rights case, now you would raise sort of the legitimacy of whether the person's a member of that religion, but the bigger fight's going to be on whether the letter you refer to is good enough. And the other thing may be you might just decide as an employer, I've got something, it's rational. I'm still going to make them submit to the rapid antigen testing. Maybe that's good enough, and it's not worth World War III over this. But
so from what I can tell, they're not going to poke the bear on that one. It was a curious situation, and I thought the Human Rights Tribunal is going to be busy for the next 10 years. So
they tried to make themselves less busy by issuing an edict saying we think these are okay.
Right. They did try to get in front of it. Now, you also talked about policies having an end date. Should there be an absolute end date or a disclaimer that it will be revisited, updated?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think you say the policy, the employer retains the right to revisit the policy and make changes as it sees fit. So I think you want to treat it as indefinite. Some policies I've seen is saying, okay, this is going to be in effect from A until B. And then as of B, we're going to sort of reevaluate, and that's fine, except that if you put that in your policy, especially if you're a small business, you actually have to remember the end date. And you actually have to then say, okay, we've considered it and we think we still need the policy or we need some different version of the policy. And so the easier thing to do is to say, it's indefinite, we're reviewing it, we will update it as need be, and we're retaining discretion to do so.
Okay, good. So next question, for an employee who is not in compliance with employer policy after sufficient time to either comply or provide an exemption certificate, what are the employer's options? Place on leave without pay until in compliance, termination with cause, termination without cause?
Well, those are the options. I don't think termination with cause will work. Maybe if you're in one of the mandated industries and you've given sufficient notice. I suspect that's not anybody here, but I may be wrong. Outside of a mandated industry, I think your options are to say you're essentially on an unpaid leave of absence. I think that's the preferable approach. Because that puts the onus on the employee to say, you have constructively terminated me, and to say that that change in the job requirement to be fully vaccinated or to submit to rapid antigen testing is a repudiation of the employment agreement or somehow shows the employer doesn't want to be bound by the terms of the employment contract anymore. If you terminate without cause, then all of that's out the door. And like any other termination without cause, it's just a matter of, do I have a contract that's enforceable, that limits my obligations to my employee in this situation, or do I have to pay them common law notice? If it's common law notice, what's a reasonable notice period, subject to their obligation to mitigate by trying to find comparable work somewhere else? And so it's a long way of me saying it's just a matter of how much do you have to pay them. If you make the decision to terminate, without cause. And I've seen that, like some places just said, you know what, we're not doing this, but they're bigger organizations. They said, we're cleaning this up. We're essentially making a policy decision that everyone's going to be fully vaccinated, and we're prepared to bear the cost of having to terminate workers, even potentially long-term workers who don't want to get in line. And again, I don't think it's going to be viewed as discriminatory by the Human Rights Tribunal. But if you terminate, you're absolutely going to have to pay them their severance or the common law pay in lieu of notice.
Okay, because that was another question: is if they refuse, are they entitled to compensation if you terminate them? So you're saying yes, they would.
Well, if you terminate them, I mean, the other thing to do is to say, you're still my employee, but I'm putting you on unpaid leave. And then you would want to review your own policies with respect to your benefits if you have group benefits, and you'd want to review the benefit plan itself, because some of those plans say after a certain amount of time where you're not providing active employment, you are no longer eligible for benefits. Some of those plans require the workers to contribute, and if they don't contribute, they're not eligible for benefits. Some places have their own policies that essentially say benefits are for active employment, which is permissible. And if you're going to be on an unpaid leave, you're not going to have benefits. And or you may make the decision to say, we'll leave this person on the group plan, but we're not paying them their wages. If you take that approach, then your costs are sort of minimal to the employee, and then the burden lies with the employee to prove that you not letting them come into work amounts to a termination of the employment. But if you want certainty and you don't want that hanging over your head, you can pull the trigger, but then you're going to have to pay them. Because I don't see any scenario where, with a possible exception of a mandated industry, where a court would uphold this as a just cause termination that means the employee doesn't get any pay in lieu of notice.
Okay, so a person that's on leave, what are the requirements if they decide to return to work? Do they return at the same pay, same position, same hours?
Yeah, it should be the same job, because it just should be treated like any other leave, right? I shouldn't lose my job because I've gone on unpaid leave. So,
okay, and that can be an indefinite period of time that you can leave somebody on unpaid leave?
here it is, and that's where where the rubber's gonna hit the road on that is at some point the worker's either going to get a job somewhere else, although I think that's getting increasingly hard because I do think these are becoming increasingly more common, or they're going to say, you fired me constructively, and they're going to bring a claim against you, either starting with a demand letter or a formal claim. You're going to have to deal with it that way. I mean, there may be some workers who just sit there forever, but at some point, whether that's a matter of months or weeks or many, many months, it's going to depend on the individual worker. But at some point, a worker's either going to get another job and move on, or they're going to comply with your policy, or they're going to say, I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to bring a claim against you. I mean, when that is depends on the individual worker, but I don't think you're going to have somebody sitting there forever. But you also have to recognize that that's why you get back to the idea the policy is not definite. And if we actually get to a point where the pandemic's endemic and you can safely say you don't need a mandatory vaccination policy anymore, then you can invite the person to come back to work. At that point, you're going to face other practical concerns, which is you're not going to keep their job open, right? So like there's a difference between leaving them there and when you recall them that you have to bring them back at the same rate of pay into the same or a comparable job like they were on a leave, and actually not backfilling the job. You can backfill the job. The problem's going to be when you bring them back, you have to give them a comparable job. You have to give them comparable pay or the same pay. And then if you're overstaffed, you got to make a decision about who you're getting rid of. And whoever you get rid of is going to be entitled to pay in lieu of notice, or what most people call severance. So
yeah, maybe you bring those people, if you're backfilling, do you put those people on contract? Maybe, or something like that.
Well, if you put them on, the problem with, yeah, that's right. The people you're bringing in, you can put them on contract, and then you face the same sort of challenges that we all face. Is when you're trying to hire somebody and you're trying to hire them for a meaningful position. If you only offer them a temporary position, you've reduced your pool of potential candidates, and you've sort of set up a situation where they're not necessarily going to be as loyal to you, and that if they can find an indefinite job somewhere else, they're going to take it. I would think. Right. I would.
Right.
I wouldn't blame them. So with the other approach you can do when you backfill those positions is you can ensure we have, and I can help you put it together, is you have an employment contract that at least limits your exposure on termination, so that if you do end up in a situation where you have too many people, that at least you know what you have some certainty about what it's going to cost you. I mean, the bigger problem becomes every time this happens, it seems like, or at least the people who call me, is invariably the employer likes the second person, not the other person. And now they're faced with the choice between the bigger liability claim and getting rid of the worker they like better. But it's not as though that can't be dealt with. It can. It just may end up costing a bit of money.
Yep. It's the cost. Okay, so we did have a question that came in from Kevin. Kevin, did you want to ask this one directly? If you take yourself off mute, you're welcome to, or I can ask it for you. Doesn't matter.
Sure. You mentioned earlier about having a customer that does not allow entry. And I think I heard you mention something about a legal responsibility to make accommodation to serve. Is this a legal responsibility, or can you bar them from entry and from service?
Yeah, you can bar them entry and you can deny service to somebody. You just can't do so in a way that's discriminatory. So if somebody legitimately is able to say, I'm not able to be fully vaccinated because I have an actual medical certificate, and you're barring them from any service at all, that might be viewed as being discriminatory. If somebody's just gonna, as people have been allowed to do throughout the pandemic, just sort of baldly allege that they have a medical clearance, for example, not wearing a mask, right? I don't think you have to necessarily accept that. So you can serve whomever you want. It's your business, but you can't discriminate against people when you're providing services. So if there's a human rights protected ground that's being raised, that's a different story. But generally speaking, you can serve whomever you want. You're a private business.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Does anyone else on the call have any questions for Dennis while we're here? Because I think I did let the folks at the airport know, Dennis, that particular question that they sent in, you're going to handle offline.
Yeah.
With them. So anybody else got anything to add, anything they need clarified? So I think that pretty well wraps up all the questions we had that came into us in advance of the webinar. So we can let Dennis go and have his lunch if we're all done. I think, Melissa, you've provided some resources here. Did you want to just speak to what you've found there?
Yes, actually, I give credit to Lori because she passed it along to me. It's the Workplace Safety Plan Builder from the Government of Ontario. So I'm going to send that out in an email, but it's also in the sidebar chat. And it says, as an employer, it's important to have a plan for how you will help to prevent occupational illnesses and injuries. Using this tool, you can think through some of the COVID-19 risks in your workplace. There's flexible responses, there's liabilities, and that can just be another resource for anyone to use. So feel free to take that. And there was also an email that I sent out a few minutes prior to this webinar beginning, and that was 3 different resources that you can use as a template to build your own plan, and some resources from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce that were given to us earlier during the pandemic.
Yep, those tenets that they said to consider when you're creating your policy. And that was in advance of the province coming up with the proof of vaccination, but it's still very relevant when you're creating your policy. So I think that'll wrap it up for us here. I want to thank Dennis Tusnard again for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate your expertise and the time that you've freed up for us today. And I want to thank all of you for attending and wish everybody a safe and happy Thanksgiving. Everyone, I hope we get some sunshine. It's supposed to come maybe on Sunday. So looking forward to that. So be well, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Thank you again. And I hope to see you all in person one day soon.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Now you can all
Thanks,
enjoy your
Dennis.
lunch.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Nice to see you, Sean. I hope I'll come and visit soon. Before your kids are teenagers, We're getting up there. Okay, bye, guys.
That was great. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yep, I think he answered a lot of questions. So we are able to now send that out to people. Can we
Yes.
send the whole thing out, and then maybe we can actually give it to